Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is David Ward. I'm the Director of Business Development with AKAM in Southeast Florida. And we have a very interesting topic today to discuss with a great panel, two experts in the industry in Florida. And we're going to be covering how Florida's new legislative updates will impact funding reserves for your condo association and not so much HOAs, but definitely condo associations. With so much changes in the last year or two, especially with the legislation changes, I'm really excited to have both Nick and Steven today to talk about what can be rather complex, especially for general managers and for boards. So we'll get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty, certainly an overview. And both Nick and Steven are true experts in their field. It's great to have a reserve study expert and then also a CPA to truly talk from their areas of expertise. So I think we're going to get started. We're about 2 minutes in. So again, just a quick introduction and welcome. My name is David Ward, Director of Business Development, Southeast AKAM. Our company, if you're not familiar with us, does luxury property management on the association side for both condominiums and HOAs. We're going to be speaking very soon with Nick Brenneman, a regional account manager with Reserve Advisors, their reserve study company, and Steven Gladstone, who's a CPA in his CPA audit firm, Gladstone and Company. So just to kind of give an overview of what we're discussing today, to give you an idea of what's ahead over the next, we're shooting for about an hour. We're going to have some Q&A at the end. But basically, after obviously our introductions, what is a structural integrity reserve study? That is the new animal in this whole topic that we're facing in the industry for condo associations. And you might hear someone say SIRS. They're not saying, like a salutation or anything like that for Mr. It's a specific type of reserve study, and it has to do with post-SIRS side and the new structural requirements thereof. So we'll be getting into that related to Senate Bill 154, how that has to do with the SIRS, and then reserve advisor insights will be coming from Nick and his experience with his company, and then also we'll have the CPA accountant insights from that side of the fence with Steven and from his experience as well. And then of course we'll finish with question and answer. So please, while we're kind of going through everything, there's going to be quite a lot. Go into the chat. Definitely let us know if there's any specific questions that we haven't covered. We did get at least one or two Q&As in advance that we already integrated into the presentation, but definitely this is an interactive kind of discussion, and we want to hear what your questions are because this is a bit tricky topic. So with that, we'll start with, I'll pass it over to Nick Brenneman and with Reserve Advisors, and we'll get into this new specific thing called a SIRS.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to learn a little bit more about these requirements. It's very important information. It's rapidly changing, and there's different messages out there. So you have come to the right place. We're going to set the record straight, tell you what you need to know, give you the latest and greatest when it comes to the structural integrity requirements in the state of Florida. When we're talking about a structural integrity reserve study, that is really a brand new product that was invented in Tallahassee when they passed Senate Bill 4D last May. Before that, we've been doing reserve studies, regular reserve studies for about 30 years as a company. There was no such thing as a structural integrity reserve study. So if we kind of backtrack, when they passed that law and they wrote that into it, everybody said, well, what is that? There were kind of more questions than answers, if you will. And so from that point on, there was just a lot of clarification that was needed, interpretations. We understood the legislative intent, but exactly how was the best way to execute it and what was feasible for associations was kind of up in the air. So I'm sure that when you hear structural integrity reserve study, it means different things to different people. But basically what it is and what they created was a reserve study that is specifically related to and containing structural components at the association. And technically it's a non-invasive visual inspection of critical infrastructure that relates to the safety of a building. So you need to have one of these done at your condo in Florida, and it needs to include an inspection. It's a non-invasive visual inspection, but we're basically looking to verify the observable condition, see if there's any issues. And really the objective with that is to give you funding recommendations when it comes to your reserves. So, as you have your operating budget for your day-to-day, your month-to-month, but then for those big ticket items for your capital needs, those are really the costs that you need to identify a funding source ahead of time. And that's really why reserves exist, is so that you can do that. You can say, what are these components going to cost and when do they need to be repaired or replaced, and then start funding according to those recommendations. We don't have a crystal ball, but it is very obvious, and I think everyone would agree that nothing lasts forever. Getting old is expensive, and there's experts like a firm like ours that this is what we do day in and day out. We can, we send an engineer on the property, we assess the observable condition of those components, give you an estimated cost, and then lay out a plan. So the structural integrity reserve study basically took the reserve study that's been in existence for 30 plus years, has standards. There's CAI is an organization that's created these national reserve study standards, and they said, okay, we want that, but we want it for the structural components. And so the scope of work for your structural integrity reserve study includes, they were very specific in the law. They listed out, they itemized out these components. So I'm going to list them off. It's your roofs, it's your structure, your load-bearing walls, your fireproofing and protection systems. It's your plumbing, your electrical systems, waterproofing, common area windows, exterior doors and painting, and then any other items that have a deferred maintenance expense over $10,000, and failure to replace or maintain would negatively affect any of those other structural components. So sort of a catch-all there, but still related to the structural components. And then the study includes an analysis of the reserve funds, as I mentioned, to offset future repair and replacement costs associated with that related infrastructure. And the idea here is that those items in that list are essential to the safety and the structural integrity of your building. And so they take, these multi-story buildings, and the whole legislative intent here, as with any, this 4D and now 154, was after Surfside. This is a reaction where everybody was alarmed, the industry was shaken to its core, and they said, we need to do everything we can to prevent and prevent this from ever happening again, and protect people who are living in condominiums, protect boards that are trying to do the right thing, so that they can keep these buildings safe. And so that's why they pulled out these specific structural items. If you want to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about 154. So this is what's known as the glitch bill. And they passed 4D, which was the original condo safety bill, last May. And then, as I mentioned, there was a lot of questions. And so people were speculating and waiting for what they called the glitch bill, or the correction or the clarification type of bill. And so in the last legislative session, we got just that, which goes by the name of Senate Bill 154, which basically kind of tightens things up, adds some much needed clarification. And I think it's important to understand that, because this truly is the latest and greatest. So if last year you learned a lot about CSRS and the requirements in the law, you want to know this. This is the latest, and it changes some of that. Perhaps you were under the impression that one thing was the new requirement, and now hearing these changes, it'll give you some good insight. So the first thing that this glitch bill did is that it expanded who could do structural integrity reserve studies. And this bill was signed, the glitch bill 154 was signed just a few weeks ago by the governor. So everything is finalized. He signed on the dotted line. It's a done deal. So if you were waiting to get your structural reserve study until it was a done deal, now would be the time to get it done, because this isn't going anywhere. But what the first change was that it added a new designation of who could provide structural integrity reserve studies. And this is really important because there's, as you've probably heard, there's a big mismatch in supply and demand when we're looking at the marketplace. The supply being what was previously the two designations that could do SIRS according to 4D was licensed engineers and licensed architects. So we're talking about PEs, professional engineers, and licensed architects in Florida. Those were the only two that could do structural reserve studies before this glitch bill. They've now added PRA, which is a professional reserve analyst. That's an additional designation. And they've added RS as another designation, which is a reserve specialist. And that is a designation that's governed by CAI, the Community Associations Institute. And what that does is it adds more supply to the market, where if you look at the number of condos that need SIRS and the number of licensed engineers and architects, it was a huge mismatch. And then you say, okay, if the deadline is the end of next year, it's a human impossibility that every condo will be able to get what they need in time. And so that's why they've opened it up further. So it's good to know that you don't need a professional licensed engineer or architect to do your SIRS anymore, but you can have a RS or a PRA do that as well. As long as that inspection is verified by one of those designations, you're still in compliance. Good news, because as I said, more supply. So hopefully there's greater availability. And also, at least with us, the professional engineers come at a higher hourly rate. And so hopefully this will save you some money on your SIRS if you haven't done it yet, since you don't need to use a professional licensed engineer or architect. The second thing is that they've clarified that you can rely on the visual inspection portion of the SIRS. You can utilize your milestone inspection if it's been done within the last 5 years. So this is helpful because these are two new requirements. You got your SIRS and your milestone inspections. And finally, there's some coordination of the two. There's not a whole lot there, but this was much needed for those associations that need their milestone and need their SIRS. Another question with the original bill was that the deadline to get your SIRS done is December 31st of 2024. So that gives all associations until the end of next year to have their SIRS done. But the question came in as far as how does that interact with our budgeting timeline or our budget cycle? And in the glitch bill, they've clarified that any budget adopted on or after January 1 of 2025 must include the funding specified in the SIRS as the basis for your reserve funding for the structural components. This is good news because it means that likely next year when you're working on your 2025 budget, it will be adopted before January 1 of 25. So even though you have to have the SIRS before the end of 24, you can still do your regular type of budgeting without incorporating the SIRS into it, as long as that budget's adopted before January 1 of 2025. So it gives you a little more breathing room. It doesn't extend the deadline because you still need to have the SIRS done by the end of next year. But it gives you some extra breathing room there from a budgeting type of standpoint. They've also clarified in the glitch bill that the waiver of non-SIRS components is still permitted. And what that means is the structural components that are identified in the SIRS that I just talked about, you have to fully fund according to your structural reserve study for those components. This is a major part of the legislative intent here, is that there was a real vulnerability allowing associations to continue to waive or continue to partially fund their reserves when it came to those vital structural type of components for building safety considerations. So while you need to fully fund and cannot waive the structural components, you still can, and they've clarified this, you can still waive or partially fund anything that's not one of those structural components. We would call general or non-structural reserves. Previously, you needed a majority vote of the membership of a quorum at a duly called meeting to to waive or partially fund those reserves. If you don't get that vote, then you had to fully fund according to the study, the reserve schedule. Now they've actually raised the bar for waiving your general reserves. And this also applies if you're less than 3 stories. This also applies. This is kind of the one thing that actually applies to you, is that if you want to waive your reserves now, you don't need a majority of a quorum, but you need a majority of the entire voting interest, the total membership, in order to do that. So for 3 stories and above who need the SERS, you can still waive the general components, but you need a majority of the total membership. And if you're less than 3 stories, you could still waive your reserves since you don't have that structural requirement. But again, you would need a majority vote of total membership. So they've raised that bar. That's part of this glitch bill. They've also clarified that reserve contributions may be adjusted to account for inflation. We're living in hyperinflation right now, and that's coming. That's after a period of relatively stable inflation for many, many years. So it's important that we're able to add some sort of an inflationary factor into our expenditures, into our funding plan, because if we're not, then we're going to have a shortfall. And so they've clarified that that's allowable. As a professional firm, that's always been our recommendation. You need to have inflation included in your reserve funding. Also, reserve funding only applies to items that are association responsibility to maintain. This is really important because the previous bill listed those structural components, but it didn't give this clarifier. And so there were many associations who had components on that list that the association may not have been responsible for. And so the burning question in everyone's mind was, okay, well, it's on the list, we can't waive the funding. Does that mean that all of a sudden we need to start funding for this component, even though it's not association responsibility, it's the owner's responsibility? Now we have that clarification. That's not the case. You do not need to fund in your structural reserve study for components that are not association responsibility, even if they're on that list. They've removed floor and foundations. The original list had floor and foundations. Those have been removed, and they have kind of cleaned that up and added structure, primary structural systems, and exterior doors to the list of the SERS components. So those are kind of the main things to be aware of that passed just this month in that glitch bill. At its highest level, all condominiums in Florida that are 3 stories and above will need a structural integrity reserve study. It doesn't matter the age of the building. It doesn't matter where you are in relation to a coastline. It's a very simple criteria. If you're 3 stories or above, you need to have the structural integrity reserve study. I stress that there's a lot of misconception because the milestone inspection, the age comes into play. It doesn't matter how old you are. Everybody has to have it done, and it has to be done before the end of next year, 12/31/2024. The reporting cycle on the structural integrity reserve study is every 10 years. So this is something that you're going to need to be doing every 10 years after you do the first one. If you want to go ahead and advance, go ahead.
Nick, if I could jump in before we go to the next slide, I like
Sure.
that you covered the clarification in the 154 bill about that if you happen to be a manager on the call or a board member on the call that's a little bit more tenured building or was built 30 years ago or more, that it seems like, and correct me, Nick, too, if I understand it right, the statute and legislation, Tallahassee allowed you to get some efficiencies there and some savings, that if you are already in the process of getting a milestone inspection by the required deadline, they'll allow you to also use that information for your SERS so that you're not having that double cost. Is that correct?
Yes, they did add something. I can pull up the specific wording because I think it's important. This is how they state it. If the milestone inspection required was completed for a similar local requirement, if it was performed within the past 5 years and meets the requirements of this paragraph, such an inspection may be used in place of the visual inspection portion of the structural integrity study. So if you have a milestone within the last 5 years, then you can use that as the inspection portion of the structural integrity study. Now, you would still have to have all of the reserve funding part added to the structural reserve study. That's the big differentiator between the milestone and the SERS, is that the milestone doesn't talk about funding at all. It doesn't talk about the, the repair and replacement over time, just the, natural deterioration and aging of those components. So,
Right.
but you can utilize the inspection, which is great, because they're asking associations to do a lot in a little bit of time and at the expense of the association. So that's something that if you can take advantage of, I certainly would.
Yeah. And the last thing too, quickly, Nick, we'll move to the next slide in just a second. For also board members and managers on the call, you're going to hear also us mention this a couple of times, especially also Steven as the CPA. Always use your attorney as needed, especially in general for our call. This is informational. This is our best information that we have with good intentions, but always use your attorney when needed and advised to get that legal counsel that's needed, especially when you're trying to get to that point on this slide that says, okay, reserve funding only applies to items that the association is responsible, not for other items the association is not responsible. If you need that clarification in your declaration, certainly go to your attorney. That's not going to be somebody like Nick or reserve study.
Correct. Yeah, that's a great point. And one other thing, which I don't think we have in the slide deck, but 4D and 154 make it very clear that a failure to get a milestone inspection before the deadline, or a failure to get a SIRS before the deadline, is considered a breach of your fiduciary duty to the association, and you can be held personally liable. So they're really taking this seriously. And they, if you don't do it, they would essentially could claim you're not acting in good business judgment, and then even your directors and officers insurance wouldn't cover you for that type of negligence that they would consider. So it's very serious. If you need to get it done, because they want to make sure that associations are complying.
It's a new era for sure.
Yep. So I think I've covered some of these, but want to make sure that we don't miss anything important here. So why are the requirements changing? The biggest thing was that associations that just constantly were waiving the reserves, they were putting future boards in an impossible position. They were making what is once manageable become unmanageable. And that's fine if we're talking about resurfacing your tennis courts or doing some sort of luxury product or discretionary amenity. But if we're talking about waiving reserves for these essential components that are essential to just the structural integrity of your building, that's where there was this real vulnerability. Another reason why the requirements are changing is there's never been, well, there wasn't, at least near term, a requirement to have a reserve study done in the state of Florida. You have, for condos, you have to have a insurance appraisal every 36 months. But when it came to reserves, 718 does require that you prepare the reserve schedule every year. But they never said that you had to have an independent third-party professional reserve study. It's always been a best practice. There's firms out there that do these day in and day out, but there was never a requirement for that independent inspection. And so that's something that not allowing you to waive the structural reserves and requiring a third-party independent inspection, they're really trying to get in front of these, in front of these associations and make sure that they're doing the right thing, and that the board doesn't have the ability to really set the future of the association up to be in an impossible position that could jeopardize not only their financial standing, but the safety of its residents. And the SIRS deadline, that is, as I mentioned, 12/31/2024, as far as having the report done, the inspection done. And remember, with the budgeting, that any budget adopted on or after January 1 of 25 needs to have the SIRS as the basis for funding the reserves. So you do have a little bit of extra room there in your budget cycle. Who can conduct the SIRS? Originally, the law, when they created SIRS, it was licensed PE, licensed architect. Now they've added the RS and the PRA, which are not professional engineers. And again, more supply, hopefully coming at a lower cost. That's good news all around. This next one, so what does fully funded mean? So with the structural reserves, since you can't waive them, they say that you have to fully fund your structural reserves. And so this idea of reserve funding has come into play. And I think it's more important now than ever that board members, managers understand reserve funding, the different methodologies, how it's achieved, because before, if you got a reserve study done and you wanted to just ignore it completely, as long as you got that member vote and, could justify it, you didn't have to fund those reserves. But now, since you have to fund according to your structural reserve study, let's do ourselves a favor as the board, as the managers, and make sure we understand what the real requirement is, what our options are when it comes to funding the reserves and still be in compliance with the statute. And so basically fully funded according to the statute allows for different funding methodologies. You could do what they call a fully funded balance, which is 100% funded. You could also use a cash flow type of an analysis. So there's a threshold funding, and then there's baseline funding, both of which are cash flow analyses. And all three of those are statutorily compliant with 718 as it's always been, and now with the SERS as well. So what I'm saying is that you don't have to fund 100% reserve balance for all of your components, meaning you don't have to have all the money at once in your reserve account. There are some people that would say that that's the best thing to do, or that's the best position to put the association in. But in actuality, if your funding objective is only to achieve this 100% funded balance number, then you're likely overfunding your reserves, because there's other funding methodologies available where you're not going to run out of money. In fact, you're going to have an extra cushion or threshold, and they're still compliant with the statute. So for example, threshold funding is a cash flow analysis where we look at the timing and the magnitude of the expenditures and then offset that with influxes to your reserve account. And so we're looking at very gradual, steady contributions to your reserves. And then we look on a 30-year horizon or whatever the length of the study is. And we can see as you're saving your reserves, where your balance is, and then as you spend on a project, where it ends up. And it's basically this balance of spending and saving of your reserves, making sure that when you have a major expenditure, let's say we do all the roofs or the cooling tower or something like that, we're drawing our reserve balance down because we're spending a lot in our reserves, but we're staying above some sort of a threshold or cushion. We call that threshold funding. That's our professional recommendation. And it's also going to give you the lowest contribution requirement. So it's important. I'm happy to talk about this more and show you examples if you want to reach out to me. But it's really important because not only now do you have to start funding these reserves, so this big step up from where you've been, but there's some people who are under the mindset or would even recommend that, well, you need 100% fully funded balance. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to achieve in the near term, especially if you're underfunded or haven't funded reserves in the past. That type of an increase is going to be very challenging, very painful, when in reality, you don't have to have 100% funded balance. Fully funded, there's two distinctions here. There's the fully funded balance, which is all the money at once to replace the component, or there's fully funded budget, which is really what the statute is calling for. Fully funded budget means that you are on track, the way that you're contributing to your reserves over time, that you're following the recommendations of the reserve study, and that you're not going to run out of money, that you're going to be cash positive or remain above some sort of a threshold. The statute even allows for what they call baseline funding, which is a cash flow analysis where there's no threshold, there's no cushion. So those years where you're spending a lot, as long as you remain above zero, that's still statutorily compliant. So you can be very aggressive with it. And the other thing, and then I'll move on to the next topic, but this is so important, is that if your objective is just to achieve this high reserve balance, this 100% funded balance, then you're really just ignoring the timing of the expenditures as you're saving up your reserves, and you're overfunding your reserves. And so let's say you end in, whenever you achieve that number, you've got a lot in reserves. It looks good, it feels good, but it's really hard for me as a reserve provider or you as a board to justify to the membership why you need all of this money just sitting in your reserves when there's no projects coming up that are requiring that type of a balance. And so I would caution you that if you're following some sort of a path, for funding, make sure that it aligns with the expenditures and that you're not just trying to hit some sort of a percentage number, maybe thinking that that's what is required according to the statute. Cash flow analysis, what they call pooled funding, is completely acceptable according to the statutes, and it will allow you to fund at a lower assessment level. So, don't make it harder than it needs to be. Don't go, up here when you can still be in complete compliance and acting in the best interest of your association, knowing you're not going to run out of money, and then fund at a more reasonable type of a reserve increase. The other thing to be aware of, if you are putting together this type of a cash flow analysis, is the threshold. The board has the discretion to change how much they want that threshold to be. So if you want to take more of a conservative approach and say, you know what, the years where we're really spending a lot of our reserves and drawing down our reserve balance, we want a nice high threshold so that we have that extra cushion, that extra peace of mind. Or the board, that's a lever that you can pull. Or the board can say, you know what, we want to take that threshold down, have a lower threshold, closer to baseline being kind of the ultimate there. So you do have the discretion there as well. So talk to your reserve provider and come up with the plan that works for you, and ultimately will still comply with the statutes.
Nick, if I could jump in quick and just clarify for the board members and CAMs on the call. If I followed you as far as what you're saying, because this new SERS is such a new item and it is raising the requirements in terms of funding, if I understand you correctly, what was in the past of maybe an optional approach between straight line funding or pooled method for reserves, it feels like, if I'm hearing you correctly, that pooled method is now going to lean towards almost highly preferred for the associations, that they'll have the most flexibility in terms of the cash flow method or the threshold if they want. If they only go straight line, they won't have that flexibility. Is that correct?
Right, because when you're calculating the reserve contribution for straight line, you calculate each component individually. You look at its straight line depreciation, so you look at the remaining useful life, the unfunded balance, so the portion that you still need to fund and how much time you have, and it's straight line, straight math. And you do that individually, and then you add them all up at the end. And so you're kind of doing each one on its own, and then at the end getting this aggregate number. When you're doing a cash flow analysis for your reserve funding, you can take more of a strategic approach because we're looking at everything all at once, and we're just balancing the cash in and the cash out. And we're coming up with a plan that takes into account the timing and the magnitude of those expenditures and how they interact with one another to make sure that the cash is going to be there. So it's this balance of spending and saving, cash in and cash out. So greater flexibility, typically lower funding requirements. So historically, if you've had the same components, same useful lives, same replacement costs, and you ran kind of a side-by-side comparison, your component funding recommendations would be higher than what the cash flow would require. It's just the nature of that funding methodology.
So definitely check. Now's the time to check with your attorney. If you don't know if you're straight lined or if you're pooled method, that's common. It's a technical kind of item for cash operations. You can confirm that with your management company. You can confirm that with your attorney. And if you're interested, say they confirm that you are straight line. If you're interested in transitioning to pooled, it can be a little bit tricky on your past funding. It's a lot easier on future funding. And your attorney can walk you through how to convert even past straight line funds over to pooled so that you can get that flexibility that Nick's talking about.
Yep, absolutely. I would say, just be aware that there's different methodologies out there, that the statute allows you to take these different options. And fully funded does not necessarily mean a fully funded balance, but they want to make sure that you're on a path where you're going to have all the money that you need, which is definitely much more of a reasonable approach, and still fulfilling your fiduciary duty, still making sure that you're going to be in a financially sound position. And then the SERS needs to be completed, as I mentioned, every 10 years. So we can jump to the next slide. And
Okay,
I will
great.
let Steven take it.
Nick, thank you so much. We're going to switch over to Steven Gladstone, CPA. And just to give everyone on the call the CPA insights of how that affects budget, what's technically correct in terms of the accounting. And we ask Steven to take it away.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, we're going to talk about the impact of the bill on the budget that the association passes annually. Now, the association is required to have within their operating budget a budget for reserves. So the reserve funding, as we've been talking about, is there's really two pieces of the reserve funding. There's the old statutory reserve funding, which was the roof, paving, painting, and anything that was going to cost more than $10,000 in the future. And now there's the new SERS reserve funding. Now, because of the new reserve funding, there's probably going to be a significant impact on the budgets going forward. And the slide shows that there's this consideration of a 15% annual increase. What that means is that if the board passes a budget that has a maintenance assessment to the unit owners that's more than 15% of the prior year's maintenance assessment, there is a mechanism whereby the membership can challenge that budget and provide a budget of their own. It's a little bit complicated. You need a certain percentage of the membership to do that, etc. But the important thing to remember is that if the increase in the maintenance assessment is more than 15% and it's a result of the funding of the reserve, then the challenge is not allowed, because the 15% increase only relates to the operating portion of the budget and not the reserve portion of the budget. So that's an important thing to remember. In terms of when this all needs to be enacted, we were talking about budgets that are approved January 1st, 2025 or after. That has created some discussion regarding if an association passes a budget in 2024 for 2025, are they required to meet the requirements of the SERS funding? There's a lot of discussion about that. My understanding is that if it's passed in 2024, then you've put off for a year the requirements of the SERS in the budget. If you have a different opinion on that, Nick, I'd like to hear that. But that's the discussions that I've been hearing amongst the accountants. So that would create the true partial funding deadline for reserves, because subsequent to that, the full funding of the SERS requirement is there. And
So Steven,
go ahead.
Steven, just checking into what you were just saying, always want to double check with your attorney, because that's the right way to go for your association. But basically, if the attorney confirms, it very well may be that, say you have your October or November 2024, I should say 2024 budget meeting this November, for example, and then the next year you're going to have something similar, October 2024, I should say. That's going to be for the 2025 budget. It's done before the 12/31/2024. So that could still be, partially funded and not related to SERS. So the first real required budget would be 2026. I recommend that would be needed to be confirmed by your counsel, just to be safe. But I agree with Steven that that's also what I'm hearing.
And in fact, everything that we're talking about is governed by Florida statute. And so it is always a good idea to ask your attorney to put their blessing on whatever it is that you're trying to do. As accountants, we do not interpret statute. We work with it, but we don't interpret it. So absolutely discuss with your attorney how you want to move forward with that type of information. I had something else and it just skipped my mind. So now I know what it was. The glitch bill 154, what that did, which from our perspective was very important, gave the Department of Business and Professional Regulation the ability to write the rules that will govern these reserve items. Those are found in the Florida Administrative Code 61B-22. And there are rules there associated with the old reserve funding methods, but there are no rules yet with regard to the new reserve funding methods. And those may still come out. The DBPR is still in the process of writing those rules. So there may be some slight changes involved going forward in terms of pooling, escalated contributions to the fund, et cetera. So,
Steven, let me ask you in general, like with all your experience as a CPA, guiding boards and condo associations, you've probably seen many associations that at least a year or two here or there, they're running well, but maybe another year they're in a deficit and they're operating, right? Sometimes, how can we advise general managers or CAMs on the call, or how can we advise boards on the call when they might feel that pressure to kind of make the best situation of a deficit and operating, and they want to see if they can pay certain things out of reserves? And we'll talk later about a gray area. How do you typically guide your clients in those situations where there's that pressure on maybe a loss for the year in the operating?
That's a good question. Because we are auditors and come in at year end, they usually don't ask us. They usually do it and we see it after it's happened. So we're dealing with that. But when they do ask, using money from the reserve for a purpose other than what it was collected for is strictly prohibited in the statute unless a unit owner vote is provided. You can have a unit owner vote to allow you to use the money. And we get the question, like, for example, well, what if we borrow the money to pay for our insurance premium and then before year end, we've put it back in? That to me is still borrowing from the reserve and using the money for a purpose other than what it was originally intended for. And we don't recommend doing that.
Very good. Okay, well, I think we're definitely almost right on time, actually, about quarter of heading into the question and answer section. But I wanted to have both Steven and Nick kind of collaborate on this section. What are the next steps? What does this all mean for your association? There's a lot of information here. There's two large, influential bills that have happened in the last two legislative sessions. What does this all mean? The number one thing that the three of us all agree, and we've had a pre-call this week, is don't wait on this process. Start as soon as possible. So even if there's been kind of an industry standard, maybe it wasn't statute to get a reserve study done every 3 years. Even if this year you're due for your reserve study and the deadline for SIRS is next year, I recommend you get your efficiencies done. You can get the SIRS done now while you get that third year kind of traditional reserve study done. And you're going to save a few dollars. And Nick, you can correct me if not. And your SIRS done now will hold value, before the deadline. But I've already began when I was previously an on-site manager, for 8 years. Recently, we tried to quote with companies like Nick's and, typical process, bid process, 3 different companies, 3 different bids. And almost every single one were saying that if you were to submit to me a signed agreement, and this was in, I want to say May, then, you would be on for an inspection on site in say September, and then maybe a final reserve study completed in your hands, at least a first draft by October, November. And that was a month ago. So I don't want to scare anybody on the call, but we all know the domino effect of when you're planning your budget meeting, and that needs 14-day notice. And then obviously your reserves figure is often the most crucial final item that we all plug into the Excel sheets as GMs or as treasurers. So when you reverse engineer it back, you want to jump on these estimates now, get some quality reserves companies, and maybe even engineers to give you a quote, try to make a quick educated decision, at least to get on schedule and submit that approved agreement, signed agreement, so you can get on their calendar, because there is a lot of demand. So from that, I'll just let Steve and Nick jump in.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said. One thing is that some of the firms who are doing the structural reserve studies are also including your general non-structural components as well. So if that's the case, then, which is our approach, then you won't need a traditional reserve study as well. So if you are due for your traditional reserve study, or you were planning on getting that done, and you also need a SERS, well, then that works out well, because you'll have a look, it's all inclusive. So you'll have a look at all of your reserve components. The biggest distinction there is that you have two separate funding plans. So even though we're looking at everything, we have to keep it separate. The statute requires that. So you'll have a structural plan and the funding associated for that, which you can't waive. And then you'll have all of the reserve funding requirements for your other components, your general components, which you can still waive or partially fund if you so choose. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of companies that are already booked up, into Q1, Q2 of next year. I've heard many stories just in the past week of companies that are saying, call me in 3 months and we can talk about maybe getting you a proposal. Call me in January and let's talk about getting you a proposal. So we are really busy, even with that additional designation on the SERS side. The sooner you can get these done, it's going to be in your best interest, that's for sure. Because last thing you want to do is wait till the 11th hour. And I've been doing this for 13 years, and what we're seeing, the demand that we're seeing is like nothing we've ever seen before. So to say, if you contact us next year, we'll be able to get you in before the end of next year. Yeah, the last 12 years, probably, but we're kind of navigating uncharted waters right now. So
right,
you don't want to cut it too close, that's for sure.
And a reminder, that's SERS deadline, not your own budgeting deadline, right? To stay on track for your budget season and the 14-day notice. But the SERS deadline is technically the end of next year. But even so, don't wait, because to Nick's point, if you can start the bidding process now, and maybe you do make your final decision after you do your own research and vetting by, say, September, you're going to be in a lot better shape than waiting until March or May or June of next year. That's when it's going to get really murky and competitive to get on a calendar. So with that, why don't we try to go into the Q&A? I know one off the top of my head that we wanted to talk about. We have a lot of Q&A, so I want to see if I can, hopefully we have some duplicates, people asking kind of the same question. We want to go through as many as we can. Thank you so much for joining. We have over 90 people on the call. For Steven and for Nick, we maybe can start with Steven, because he brought up a great point on our pre-call. What would you say is the kind of the gray area of devising or crafting a reserve study when you have certain items that are not necessarily $10,000 each on their own, but if you have more than one pump, or if you have more than one pool to resurface or Diamond Bright, when you add them together as a category, they're well over 10,000. How would you say, Steven, is that flexibility, and maybe Nick as well? How important is that in the first draft, where the first draft of the reserve study gets to the board and it's not a final draft?
One of the concerns I have going forward are the budgets that are going to be prepared. Between the SERS and the increase in insurances that we've been seeing, there's going to be some major impact on these budgets and the maintenance assessment that members are paying. I would certainly hope that boards are approaching this from the realistic standpoint and not trying to budget to a maintenance assessment number. So to your point, the swimming pool was a good example. if you have two swimming pools that both need to be resurfaced at $6,000 a pool, well, individually, you don't have to set up a reserve for them. But in the aggregate, it's $12,000, and that would have to be included in your budget. So you might look to save some money in your budget by maybe not including them as required reserves going forward, because as I said, my concern is maintenance assessments are going to increase dramatically. And I don't want to see associations shortcutting their budget just to meet a maintenance assessment number and then potentially passing special assessments just to cover budget shortfalls, so to speak.
Right. And Nick, would you say that certainly this is a collaboration between the board and management with a company like yours in the reserve study? Because even, I love Steven's example, that's very easy to understand. $6,000 pool, but you also have a second pool, $6,000 to resurface or Diamond Bright, $12,000. That's over 10 by itself. It's not required reserve. But what if you have 300 fire exit signs and each of them are $100 to remodel, modernize them to LED? That's a $30,000 project that a board might want to attack all at once. Or they might say, look, I don't need to replace all 300 all at once. When one of them goes bad, I'll replace the $100 LED. So I think there's two different, valid approaches. And I think it's important for boards to know that this is a collaboration with your reserve study partner, with the board's input.
Yeah, those are great points, David. I think that some board members who haven't been through the reserve study process before, or maybe have had an experience with a reserve study provider, have kind of missed that ability to collaborate and customize the study according to their specific needs. And that's a really important, the fact that the reserve study does have this, it's not always black and white. There is really this gray area, depending on your specific objectives and your approach to how you want to fund items or how you've done things historically, what's worked well, or what's your objective moving forward. As a professional, there's different agreed upon approaches that are still considered acceptable. And so we want to have those conversations. So like the example you gave, I think the easiest one to illustrate that we see all the time is pool furniture. So I'd say about half of our associations that we work with include the pool furniture as a reserve component, because they plan on replacing it all at once out of their reserves, and they fund for it from there. And then the other half say, you know what, we'll just fund this out of operating, we'll replace it as needed. So as far as what components we're going to fund out of operating and versus our reserve schedule, the board definitely has the discretion and some say in that. There's other areas too, like we talked about with the cash flow analysis, that the board has the ability to determine what sort of a threshold they want to have in those threshold years. How conservative do we want to be with our reserve funding, even though we are doing a cash flow analysis? And there's other options as well. So just make sure that, I think the greatest opportunity that you have at doing a reserve study is to really collaborate with your reserve study provider. And it's the greatest opportunity because it's going to give you, if done correctly, it's going to give you the highest quality reserve study. And doing this for so long, I would define quality as usefulness, accuracy and usefulness. If you get a reserve study back, this happens, far too many times in the industry, where the association looks at it and says, oh, if they only knew this, or they're really out of touch with what's actually going on out here when it comes to what they recommended here. Well, it's also, on the board to make sure that that's not the case. So call those extra meetings with that reserve provider, make sure they know what's actually going on, what's important, and that ultimately the report is going to align with reality for you and be the most useful type of report out there. Also, it's the biggest missed opportunity too. Like if you treat this, if you do what I say, if you do the reserve study in a vacuum, then it's going to be a real challenge to get a document that you're going to be able to rely on with complete confidence, that's going to align with your strategic goals and objectives.
Right, absolutely. All right, I'm going to try to, I think if Nick and Steven are, willing, I think we can go a little bit over. We're still going to have 5 minutes until 5 p.m. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm willing to stay a little bit longer. I want to answer as many Q&A as we can. One of the first questions came in, maybe for Nick. This particular condo hired 3 different organizations to complete all the requirements that are kind of newly facing structural side, the electrical, which seems like more in the SERS, or milestone side, and then maybe a traditional reserve study. Is that condo going to have 3 different organizations submitting reports to the city? Who is actually taking the lead there? Nick, I want to hear what you have to say. I think you want to use your reserve study company as a guide. You might be able to be efficient where the engineer does consulting, does both structural and electrical. I've seen, engineering companies be able to do those both. And then maybe it's not in, say, a reserve study company's interest, but maybe they could also do the reserve study kind of in one shot. Now, if that's already done, you're still going to be looking for who's taking the lead. I wouldn't be able to say. Definitely check with your attorney. You're going to hear that advice, all the time. I don't know, Nick, do you know the requirements of who submits to the city? I think that's an attorney question that's always good to go.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the specific requirements for the city. It's a great point that you bring up, though, is that there's different firms that offer different services for all these requirements. And is there one way that we could just have one do everything? And well, it is challenging, to have multiple people involved, multiple parties involved. I also think that it's important to remember that these are the experts. And so it's kind of a necessary evil. If you want the absolute best reserve study, you're going to want to have someone that does nothing but reserve studies. If you want the absolute best electrical inspection, use it, someone that really specializes in so the idea of the one-stop shop, well, it, sounds good in theory. Ultimately, I think that the end product is not going to be the highest quality that you could get if you would stay with firms that specialize in each of their areas of expertise. We're seeing a lot of that, where people are saying, oh, we do everything. But it's firms that don't really specialize in any of those things. So I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have multiple parties involved, because you're going to get the most accurate information, the highest quality.
Right. And I would definitely check with the attorney of making sure things are submitted to the city correctly. And I agree, ideally by one person, but it might not be one entity. It might be 3 separate submittals. Next question is a good question, and I'll give my view and also defer to Nick. Doesn't the structure component in quotation marks include floor and foundation? It's my view that Tallahassee kind of did a double step, and they got some input and some pushback on including floor and foundation. How could anyone ever, put some sort of metric or life cycle on a floor and foundation? So there was a lot of feedback to the legislation in Tallahassee. So they removed that requirement from 4D. But then, in my view, they just kind of covered themselves in Tallahassee to say, well, that being said, make sure you include anything structural. And so that was a vague statement. And to your question, the gentleman that asked, if it seems like vague, they shot for clarity, and I think they kind of just did a little CYA there in terms of legislation. Nick, I don't know if you view it differently.
No, there is actually, you can take that a little bit further and do your research. So the structural systems in 154, they added a clarifier as those terms are defined in 627.706. So you can reference that for exactly what they mean when they say structural systems. So it isn't completely open-ended, but it does take a little bit more, fact finding to, reference a different resource to find out what those specific components would be. But balconies are in there, for example.
Okay, I'm just kind of going through the questions here. Yeah, there's a lot of, the question is, are there resources out there that includes changes to, Senate Bill 154 made to 718? Yes, if you actually go to our AKAM website, there is a section on there for resources. You can also go to our YouTube channel. We recently had a webinar with our Senior Vice President, Doug Weinstein, speaking exactly on this topic. What happened with Senate Bill 154 and how did it change 718? They talked to a similar amount of time. It was about an hour. And you can find it there either on akam.com or AKAM Living is our YouTube handle, AKAM Living. Next question. Isn't a failure to have the SIRS prepared a breach of the board member's fiduciary liability only if it's willful and knowingly a failure? I think that might be true. Again, that interpretation I think is tricky, and I wouldn't want to run that risk of interpretation personally if I was a board member or a CAM with my license on the line. But I think it's a great question and a great point. And again, you would have your association counsel and perhaps even insurance counsel of the carrier, defend you in that regard, but always err on caution, right? Rather than having to defend, either a complaint to the DBPR or Tallahassee. That's just my view.
Agreed.
But it's a technical, very good question. Next question: are you sure the cash flow analysis for SIRS components is allowed under 154? That's you, Nick.
Sure. So I guess everything is open for interpretation. The division has clarified that pooling is allowed, cash flow is allowed. And as a reserve professional, we've always followed the division's interpretation.
Okay, very good. Let's see. One particular association has over 2 million in reserves. They've pooled their reserves in the past. And they have a question about the next funding that would arrive in fully funding on time for the required items. How would that work? Basically, the new funding, would that arrive in time for the non-statutory items? These are all good questions in terms of what was, saved in the past or what was straight line in the past or pooled. I would definitely partner with your CPA and your attorney on these ones. Yes, it can be maybe a little bit more costly to get those billable hours. Hopefully something like that kind of consult with your CPA would be included on what's usually an annual retainer for your audit. These are your experts and great questions. Definitely don't want to avoid any question here, but those are the specifics that you're going to want to ask your experts for your board. Let's see here. Okay, so please clarify when the SIRS becomes into effect. For example, what will happen if the 2025 budget is adopted in February 2025? So I think we did cover that, but just to double check, it's important. You want to try that, Nick?
Yeah, so if you adopt the budget after January 1, 25, say February, you would have to use the SIRS as the basis for funding the reserves. For the
and some form of fully funded, right? The ones that you mentioned.
Exactly.
Okay. There was a related but unrelated question. We'll take it because insurance has been such an important part of this budgeting process. When budget increase exceeds 15% from the prior year because of insurance increase, can the membership question that increase? Really good question. I think insurance is an operating item. But again, I would personally go to my attorney because the fiduciary responsibility of a board and a CAM is to make sure you're fully insured, most importantly for property and casualty, God forbid, on a Cat 5 hurricane situation. I mean, that is the real true sense in your biggest cost of your premium every year, is to protect financially your building in the disaster situation of a Cat 5 destruction where you have to completely rebuild your building. I don't think, in my opinion, it's in the association's best interest to challenge that specific increase over 15%. Whether it can be done, that's not something that I would opine on. Again, that would be for association counsel. but
I
it's a
believe
good,
the insurance was also carved out, just like the reserves. were.
just like reserves, that would make
Yeah.
sense. Even though it's not reserves, it's a really good question because it's not
Right,
reserves, it's an
but
operating
because
item.
they're well aware of the insurance crisis that we have in the state right now
Right.
with
That's right.
premiums.
Yeah,
That was
154 exclusive from,
Specifically carved that out, I believe.
Thank you, Stephen. But again, attorney double check is always the way to go. And then let's see, I'm not sure if it was asked or answered, but can a line of credit be used for reserves? I think that's a great question. Gentlemen?
that's a good question. I don't believe so, but I can't really answer that with certainty. Steven, do you have any?
Someone asked me that question earlier today. Can they fund their reserves with a loan?
I think yes,
I think they can,
that's a special assessment. And
but the question comes in then, how do you repay that loan? You'd have to repay the loan with operating funds, I would think, or a special assessment, as you just said. But the
Right.
funding can be done, but you can't repay the loan from the reserves.
Right. Before SIRS, right, I think things were a little bit easier to understand. And there was always this high correlation between reserves and having plenty of them, or being a little bit more, say, aggressive in not fully funding reserves, in the membership knowing, well, I like my maintenance low, I like my reserves low, I don't mind getting special assessed, right?
Mhm.
So, typically special assessments, not always, but typically special assessments would be that kind of yin and yang to reserves funding. So I don't see why, and a lot of times you give the association an option, fully pay the special assessment lump sum, or, we'll structure up for you an optional 36 or, 10-year loan, 36-month or 10-year loan for you to pay, it off in installments. It's a great question, and I'm going to sound like a broken record. Definitely check with your attorney. Let's see, what else we have. We're about almost 10 minutes over. I want to get at least a couple more in. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying late with us. I think we had a great discussion. People are asking questions about, 3 stories and below, or the milestone. Really good questions. That wasn't necessarily the focus of our discussion today, because we did want to talk about SIRS and how that's going to affect budgets, because the SIRS requirement is due next year. But again, if it's 3 stories, if it's 2 stories, and if you have a milestone coming up 30 years older, these are all things that you want to just really cross your T's. Don't approach these by yourself. Check with your attorney and make sure you're doing the right thing. And I can't say it enough. It might be, $300 to $400 for that hour conversation, or that email that they'll draft you to confirm, even better. But it's going to be well worth it to cover you as a board, because your boards are volunteers. It's a thankless job. This is not your expertise. This is even not a CAM's expertise. Our job as a CAMs is to be informed, like Nick said, of the statute, or Steven, but we're not attorneys. We don't have JDs. And that's really important when things get so complex, and when liability, of course, is involved. So this group has great questions. Will it be required to report separately on regular reserves and structural reserves in the financials? Maybe Steven can take that. I think that's a great question.
That's a good question, because there is a crossover, especially when it comes to exterior painting, which is both, and roof also is both. So I don't know the full answer to that, but what I believe the structural integrity portion, the SIRS portion, because it can be funded differently than the statutory reserves or the other reserves, we haven't really looked at how to report that, but we're leaning towards reporting them separately, because even if you did a pooled reserve, I believe you'd need separate pools for the SIRS versus the statutory reserves. So separate reporting is probably the preferred method.
Thank you, Steven. Yeah, I think that's a great question and very good answer. We have a particular association in Palm Beach. that is currently subject to recertification. That might be, a 40-year process, which is now 30-year across the state. Once complete at the end of their certification, by the end of this summer, by a registered Florida PE, they're asking, would they be able to rely on those reports, the certification, not milestone, in terms of the newer term of a milestone, right? So we're kind of converting, right, from certifications, 40-year certifications, 40 plus 10 certifications to this milestone term in the new legislation from last year. Would you be able to take those certification findings and build the SIRS reserve study without performing the site inspections? I would say excellent question, Nick. I'll let you take that. It's hard to say if your local, I think it would be up to your local jurisdiction, right? Your local, whether it be a Palm Beach County, kind of sign off, or your local city and town in Palm Beach, if they would accept that information and report from your current, say 40-year certification, like it as if it's a milestone, which I think they might, but I really wouldn't be able to say. Does that make sense, Nick? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, no, I understand the question. It's hard to say with any certainty. I think that you may have a possibility, but you would want to get make sure that it's 100% certain before doing
Right.
that. The reason why I think it might be a possibility is because of that part in 154 where they say that you can use the specific wording is an inspection if the milestone inspection or an inspection completed for a similar local requirement. And I would say that the recertification is a somewhat similar local requirement. It's been performed within the last 5 years and meets the requirements of the rest of the statute. Then it may be used as a replacement for the visual inspection of the SIRS. So you kind of have to make sure that you do meet all of that criteria, kind of comparing the statutory inspection requirement versus the inspection that took place with this recertification. But I think it's definitely something worth exploring, and you may come up with some good news that, yeah, you can indeed use that. I'm not sure to answer that with any certainty though.
Yeah, we had a couple of questions that were saying it's, a little confusing, but basically if you pass your budget for your 2025 budget draft before 12/31 of 2024, if you pass that, say in November or December 10th of 2024 with a partial funding of reserves, some of us on this call believe that that's okay because you did pass the partial funding before the deadline of 12/31/2024. So if that interpretation is correct, check with your attorney, then that would mean the first budget really that you absolutely have to have some sort of fully funding pooled or threshold for structural reserves is going to be the 2026 budget, January 1st, 2026. But again, check
with your legal counsel.
Yes.
Right. And you can't, even though you still have the ability to waive or partially fund, you still need that member vote in order to do so.
Yeah. And it gets tricky in your head and it happens to me to keep clear. There's the budget component and then there's the actual SIRS completion, which is two separate things.
Right.
So Nick, if I'm following this right, the deadline to actually complete the SIRS requirement is 12/31/2024. That's it.
Yep.
But the budget aspect is kind of what I just answered prior. And depending on when you approve your budget, often, not always, a board will approve in November, October. That might allow you to first have to fully fund in 2026. But check with counsel. So,
the other thing too is if you have that information available when you're doing your budgeting, even though you're not required to use it, it's still probably a good idea to do so, or at least start working toward that, preparing yourself for the increases that are to come. Because the longer you wait and hold off, you're just delaying the inevitable. So it's good to start, making steps toward that higher level of funding once you have that information.
right. We have another question. We happen to be conducting a very large property renovation. Should we conduct our reserve study after the project is completed? Nick, take that one. And they already completed their SIRS.
Yeah, typically it's a good idea if you are doing any sort of major project and you can wait to hold off, because we want to make sure that we're incorporating everything accurately into the study. Now, I'll kind of add that reserve study professionals are used to incorporating kind of ongoing projects into the reserve study already, because it's really unusual that there isn't something that just happened or something that's currently underway or about to occur when we go out to an association to work on a reserve study. So as long as we have the information on the scope and the contract and the cost and stuff like that, then we can accurately incorporate it already, even if it's still underway. But if it's a major project, you don't necessarily, you're not in a time crunch from a statutory perspective or even just a budget perspective, and you can hold off. Yeah, I would say it's advisable. And then, a great time to get the reserve study updated is after like any sort of a major project, any sort of major capital undertaking.
Right. Steven, I don't know if you had any final thoughts. I think we definitely answered a lot of great questions. The ones I do see remaining open seem to be rather specific to an association that might not be as applicable to everyone on the call. Just to be respectful of everyone's time and to our excellent panelists, I do want to say thank you for letting us run a little bit late, a little bit more than 15 minutes over. I think we had a great discussion. Steven, before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts?
Just as Nick was saying earlier, this is inevitable. This is going to happen. So if the SIRS study has to be done by the end of 24, and January of 25 is, you can no longer waive, or you must include the SIRS study in your budget, then the sooner you get started on this, the better off you are, because those monies are going to have to be accumulated. The budget impact is going to be tough for some associations to deal with, but certainly don't slight your operations because you have to fund your reserves.
Right. No, thank you, Steven. That's great. Nick, any final insight for us before we head out?
I would just say that this is new to everybody, and there was a lot changing. And my word of advice would be, if you're going out to get your SIRS done, there's not really a whole lot of consistency in the industry yet, because it's not like a regular reserve study where there's national standards governing it that have been in place for many years. There are no standards really when it comes to the SIRS. I mean, they've outlined the requirements and the legislation, but different firms are taking different approaches, and they can be somewhat drastic. So when you're looking at different proposals between SIRS providers, just keep an open mind that it's not necessarily going to be apples to apples. It may not even be apples to oranges, given what we've been seeing. It might be more like apples to cucumbers or something. There's wildly different approaches, wildly different products that are out there. So just kind of keep that in mind, and just make sure that you know what you're getting, and that you get a firm that you partner with that you can trust and that you have complete confidence in, because you have to follow the recommendations in that report. So it's more important than ever that you feel really comfortable about who you're bringing in to get reserve advice from.
Right. And the last thing I would add to, along what you just said, Nick, is forgot to add earlier, these can be a true required investment, right, for your property and for your board. You get your SIRS and reserve study done. And these are thousands and thousands of dollars to invest and to get the right plan and the right useful data for your association. Keep in mind, a lot of reserve study companies will also offer an annual update that doesn't necessarily require an on-site inspection, which is the largest part of the cost, to actually walk the entire property and take hundreds of pictures and notes to then come back to their office and really dive into the life expectancy and the expected costs and the construction costs and replaceable costs. So if you do take that option, and it's an option that many reserves companies will give, that could be 25% of the cost of a standard, you know, three-year full kind of traditional now SIRS reserve study. So consider that, and then you can budget for approximately a $2,000, you know, annual update, where the SIRS might be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000. So it's something to keep in mind. We had a lot more questions that we didn't have a chance to answer, but I did want to say thank you so much for being on the call today, for all the board members that are volunteers working hard for your association. It's a thankless job. Thank you for taking the time to learn about your duties as board members. Thank you to the CAMs on the call today. Thank you to Nick Brenneman with Reserves Advisors. You can reach out to Nick if you have any questions that we didn't get to today, to nick@reserveadvisors.com. I'm sure Nick will be happy to take your email and then potentially have a possible relationship. If you're unhappy with your reserve study company, definitely reach out to Nick. Or if you want to see what their schedule is, you know, as far as their timeline. Steven, also Gladstone, a CPA with his CPA firm. Thank you so much for today. If you have any specific CPA questions or audit questions, please email Steven at sgladstone@gladstonecpa.com. And finally, my name is David Ward, a Business Development Director with AKAM. We are in charge of delivering and helping facilitate the luxury 5-star experience for the board of directors in condominiums and HOAs. If you have any questions at all regarding today's call, or if you're interested in our management services or looking for a change, email me anytime at dward@akam.com. Thank you all so much for today. We've had a lot of your time, but I think it was well worth it. And have a great, happy 4th of July weekend, and stay safe.